Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a really interesting situation in North America, this kind of paradox with inland fisheries. We have these highly developed countries, the US and Canada, lots of scientific know how, but still facing major conservation issues. So, we're diving into a key paper called Grand Challenges in the Management and Conservation of North American Inland Fishes and Fisheries. The lead author is Abigail J. Lynch, but it's important to note this was a huge team effort, a really diverse group of experts involved. Our mission here is basically to pull out what this paper calls the grand challenges, the big critical roadblocks stopping us from effectively managing and conserving these inland fish long term. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Why is a study like this even needed, it seems? Well, a bit strange, right? North America's got over 1,200 freshwater fish species. Management systems have been around for, over 50 years. Plus, we have serious scientific capacity. Yet, the paper argues we're hitting some major walls that our usual tools just aren't breaking down.
Yeah, that paradox is exactly why they did this. They used what's called the grand challenges approach, something used in other big fields like global health. The idea is to stop just, patching problems. Instead, you identify the really specific critical bottlenecks. If you can remove those, then you can start solving the larger systemic issues. How they did it was they got a bunch of different inland fisheries professionals together in Florida back in 2015 for some intensive facilitated discussions.
Yeah.
And the focus on just the U.S. and Canada is pretty deliberate. Globally, management capacity is all over the place. But these two countries, they share some really important similarities in structure, especially the fact that their governance is fundamentally based on the public trust doctrine.
Right, let's pause on the public trust doctrine, because it sounds like that's pretty central here. What does that actually mean in practice for fish?
Well, simply put, it means the government holds natural resources like fish, wildlife, and water in trust for all the citizens. It's not private property. So the emphasis is really on broad public access, sustainable use, and conservation for everyone. It's quite different from places with more private ownership models.
And that shared foundation access for all, that's kind of the starting point for the unique challenges they face.
Exactly. It shapes everything, particularly how things are funded and what management agencies are actually tasked with doing.
Okay, but here's where, for me, it got really interesting. When they talked about the major threats, it wasn't maybe what you'd first assume. Like, yes, overfishing is mentioned, but the paper really stresses that the biggest problems often come from outside fisheries management. Things like climate change, habitat being broken up, water being taken out, pollution.
Absolutely. That was a key finding. The biggest challenge isn't just figuring out complex fish biology anymore. It's really at that messy interface between people, fish, and their habitats.
Yeah.
And the maybe uncomfortable truth they landed on is that the human dimensions, the policy, the politics, the economics, how we communicate those complexities often dwarf the biological ones. That's why the 7 big roadblocks, the grand challenges they identified, all fall under 3 main themes: valuation, governance, and externalities.
That shift in perspective, seeing it less as just a science problem and more as a people problem, that feels like the core insight here. So let's start with that first theme, valuation. Raising awareness of all the different ways inland fish are valuable. What does that mean day to day for a manager struggling with valuation?
It means they hit this fundamental roadblock, which is the first grand challenge, 8.1.
Oh.
It's just really hard to implement ways to evaluate and compare all the different uses because you've got such diverse values, some easy to count, some not, and you need some kind of common currency to compare them effectively in policy debates. And we don't really have one that captures everything.
Right, you've got this clash.
Yeah, think about it. On one hand, you have a monetary stuff, the things you can quantify fairly easily. Like they mentioned the total economic output, the whole multiplier effect of recreational fishing in the Great Lakes. It's estimated at over $7 billion US. That's a massive number. Politicians get that.
Yeah, a number like that gets attention. But then you have all the other values, the non-material ones, the intangible stuff that's maybe harder to put a price tag on, but is, fundamentally important.
Precisely. And the paper lists them out. You've got cultural values, that sense of place, local heritage, maybe deep spiritual significance for indigenous groups. There's nutritional value. Fish can be a really accessible source of protein and those vital omega-3s for certain communities. And then the psychological side for people who fish recreationally, stress relief, health benefits. It can be part of their identity. How do you weigh a cultural tradition against a $7 billion industry in a planning meeting.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? If decisions get made based on dollars, how practical is it to push for these inclusive valuation frameworks they talk about, frameworks that try to account for cultural or spiritual worth? Can they realistically win out against, say, hydropower or big agriculture?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, or perhaps the non-million-dollar question in this case. The paper argues the solution has to involve moving beyond just listing separate indicators. We need systems that genuinely try to integrate these diverse metrics. But the critical point, the so what, is that if you can't articulate the full value, you lose political priority. It's that simple. Inland fisheries end up getting marginalized because sectors like agriculture or energy development can come to the table with these very robust-looking economic figures.
Okay, so if we can't even agree on what the resource is truly worth in all its facets, how can we possibly figure out who gets to manage it and how? Which leads us right into the second theme, governance. This is about governing fisheries to satisfy all these multiple uses and conservation goals.
Right. And conflict is almost baked in here, especially when you look at what they call the stakeholder mismatch. That's Grand Challenge B1. Often, the governance structures focus heavily on license holders because that's where the money comes from. But they overlook or even ignore people who use the resource but maybe don't need a license, like older folks or people with disabilities. Sometimes military personnel are exempt too. They're users, but they're not always counted as stakeholders in the same way.
And what about people who don't fish at all but really care about the river or the lake, boaters, kayakers, conservation groups?
Yeah, they often get left out of the formal engagement processes too,
Yeah.
and that just breeds conflict and mistrust down the line.
Yeah.
But here's something else the paper points out, which is fascinating. It looks inward at the professionals themselves. Most fisheries folks, historically, are trained primarily in biological sciences, which is great, but
But maybe not enough in the people skills.
exactly. They often don't have the formal training in communication, negotiation, conflict resolution, all the skills you actually need to manage these really complex human disagreements and engage effectively with all these diverse groups. It fundamentally changes the job description, really. It's less about just managing fish populations and more about managing people and their interactions.
That's a huge point. The solution isn't just better fish science, it's maybe mandatory social science training for managers.
Uh-huh.
Okay, let's loop back to funding, because that's a big governance piece too. We mentioned the public trust doctrine means access for all. What's the practical downside of that when it comes to funding and stewardship?
Well, one potential downside the paper touches on is that compared to private ownership, where the owner has a direct financial stake in keeping the resource healthy, the public trust model can sometimes lead to weaker incentives for individual stewardship. But the really big immediate problem is the funding structure itself and the conflict it creates within the management agencies. That's Grand Challenge B.2. The main money sources, fishing license fees, excise taxes on gear, those are generally flat or even declining in many places, and they're just not enough to cover everything that needs doing. So this sets this inherent tension inside the agencies. Part of their mandate, often funded by those license fees, is to promote fishing opportunities, to provide access. But they also have legal mandates and strong public expectation to protect endangered or threatened species.
And those two things, promoting use versus protecting vulnerable species, can directly clash, especially when budgets are tight.
Absolutely. When those mandates collide in a budget meeting, it forces some really tough choices. The paper argues this really demands innovative thinking about new, more diverse funding mechanisms to resolve that fundamental conflict.
Okay, so let's try to tie this together. We've got resources whose full value isn't recognized. We have agencies wrestling with conflicting missions and maybe lacking some key social science skills. And then layered on top of all that, you have the whole outside world impacting the resource. Which brings us to the third, and actually the largest theme, externalities. This is all about trying to maintain productive fisheries when the biggest impacts are coming from sectors completely outside of fishing.
Yeah, this is where fisheries managers often feel, frankly, the most powerless. The integration problem here is huge. It's Grand Challenge C.1. Managers can regulate how many fish people catch because that's clearly within their mandate. But they usually lack any direct regulatory authority over the really big drivers of habitat change, things like water withdrawals for cities or farms, hydropower dams, mining operations, urban sprawl.
They're stuck managing the consequences, not the causes.
Precisely. They're regulating the symptom, not the underlying condition.
So if direct regulation isn't an option, the paper stresses that effective collaboration across these different sectors becomes absolutely essential. What practical steps did they suggest to make that happen, to bridge that power gap?
Well, first, it's about the groundwork. Building collaboration takes time. It means setting common goals across sectors, finding ways to evaluate the trade-offs involved, maybe using tools like scenario planning, and critically, building trust. The paper really emphasizes that often that only happens through regular face-to-face meetings and ongoing dialogue. You can't just do it through emails.
Okay, that's the process part. What about tools?
For practical tools, they suggest a couple of concrete things. One is establishing a formal North American cross-sectoral expert directory. The idea is to make it easier for a fisheries manager to find and connect with, say, an expert in agricultural water use or urban planning when they need that specific knowledge.
That makes sense. Sharing expertise.
And the other big one is pushing for a standardized and centralized research data sharing framework, basically a central database portal. So managers aren't constantly struggling to get the environmental data they need from other agencies or sectors, make the information flow more easily.
Okay, that's about integrating human systems and knowledge. What about integrating the impacts of huge global changes like climate change? That's got to be a major externality.
Oh, absolutely. That's Grand Challenge C.2. Climate change is a massive future impact, and managers are desperate for better science to understand what's coming. Specifically, how will changes in water temperature, rainfall patterns, the timing of river flows, how will all that shift where fish can live, which species might thrive, which might decline or disappear. They need predictive models, basically, to understand the adaptive capacity of different species and plan for those shifts now, not after they've already happened.
Right, anticipating the future. Now, the last externality they cover is maybe a bit surprising. Aquaculture and fisheries enhancements. Why is something often seen as part of the fisheries solution sometimes treated as an external factor or even a problem?
Yeah, it's a complex one. It has that sort of frenemy relationship with wild fisheries. On one hand, enhancements like stocking are vital in some systems. Think about the Pacific salmon fishery in the Great Lakes that wouldn't exist without stocking, or using hatcheries to help recover threatened species. It can be essential.
Mm.
But these activities can also have significant negative impacts on the remaining wild populations. Things like ecological competition, genetic risks if hatchery fish interbreed with wild fish, nutrient pollution from fish farms, spreading diseases.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the paper calls for much more standardized, rigorous evaluation of these enhancement programs across both the U.S. and Canada. We need to be sure they're actually adding net value and not causing unintended harm to the wild resources we're trying to protect. That's Grand Challenge C.3.
Wow, okay. This has been a really methodical walkthrough of a complex issue. So just to recap the mission here, this grand challenges approach identified these 7 critical roadblocks. They fall under these big themes of valuation, governance, and externalities. And tackling these is apparently essential for sustainable use and conservation.
Yeah, and the thread connecting all of them, the primary goal that emerges, is pretty clear. The inland fish sector needs to get much better at integrating itself into the bigger picture of water and land use policy. It can't operate in a silo anymore. If you can't make the case for your resources' full value in terms policymakers understand, or if you can't effectively navigate the politics and engage all your stakeholders, you'll just continue to be pushed aside by other sectors with competing demands.
It makes a lot of sense.
And it raises a really important point the authors make at the end. They explicitly suggest that this kind of structured exercise, identifying these grand challenges, should probably be done elsewhere too, for other regions around the world facing similar issues, and maybe even for marine fisheries. It's a powerful way, they argue, to generate clear, actionable direction when you're dealing with these really complex social ecological problems. It's not just for inland fish.
That's a really interesting thought, using this structured approach as a template for other complex environmental issues. All right, before we wrap up, let's leave you, our listener, with a final thought to chew on. It builds on that emphasis on the public trust doctrine we talked about earlier. Think about this. What happens when the core idea of the public trust ensuring access for everyone starts to conflict with what might be needed to protect fragile resources in a changing climate? Like if protecting a vulnerable fish population from warming waters requires severely restricting access, maybe even closing areas entirely, how will management agencies navigate that fundamental clash between the public trust principle and the ecological reality in the decades ahead? Something to consider. Well, we hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of the critical challenges facing North America's inland fisheries and the kind of thinking needed to address them. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.